In the soft glow of a winter afternoon, the antique shop on Maple Street stood silent save for the gentle ticking of a dozen clocks. Dust particles danced in the shafts of light streaming through the cloudy windows, giving the cluttered space an ethereal quality. This was Martin Reed's sanctuary, a place where forgotten treasures came to find new meaning. The shelves sagged under the weight of leather-bound books, tarnished silver candlesticks, and an eclectic assortment of memorabilia from lives long since concluded. But it was the photographs that were Martin's true passion, faces from the past, their eyes staring out from sepia-toned prints, seeming to search for recognition across the decades. Martin, a 38-year-old photography collector with a particular interest in early 20th century portraiture, was organizing a recent acquisition, a wooden box filled with photographs from an estate sale in Vermont. His fingers, calloused from years of carefully handling delicate photographs, moved methodically through the stack. He wore a pair of white cotton gloves, a habit born from respect for the fragile history he handled daily. Anything interesting in there? Sarah, his business partner and lifelong friend, called from behind the counter where she was updating their inventory ledger. Her fountain pen scratched across the page, adding new entries in her meticulous handwriting. At 42, Sarah was the practical counterbalance to Martin's sometimes obsessive enthusiasm. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, silver threads beginning to show at her temples. "The usual," Martin replied, not looking up. "Family portraits, landscapes, a few wedding photos." His voice trailed off as he came across something that made his breath catch. "Wait a minute. What is it?" Sarah asked, setting down her pen. She recognized that tone. Martin had found something. Martin didn't answer immediately. He was staring at a sepia-toned photograph, remarkably well preserved, dated 1918 on the back in faded ink. The image showed twin girls, perhaps 8 years old, dressed in identical high-collared white dresses with ribbons in their hair, standing before what appeared to be a Victorian-style home. Their faces were solemn, as was customary for photographs of that era, when exposure times required subjects to remain perfectly still. But what made Martin's pulse quicken was their eyes. Even in the monochrome image, there was something unmistakably different about them. The girl on the left had eyes that appeared noticeably lighter than her right eye, while her twin's eyes showed the opposite pattern. Her right eye was lighter than her left. "Sarah," Martin called, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need to see this." Sarah set down her pen and joined him, leaning over his shoulder. The familiar scent of her lavender perfume mingled with the musty smell of old paper. "What have you found now?" "Look at their eyes," Martin said, handing her the photograph. Sarah studied it carefully, her brow furrowing. "Heterochromia," she murmured, naming the condition where a person has two different colored irises. In twins, no less. "That's quite rare." She turned the photograph over, examining the back. "Is there any identification?" Martin nodded, his finger tracing the faded handwriting. 1918 and a name. Eleanor and Elizabeth Blackwood, Ravenwood Estate. "Ravenwood," Sarah repeated thoughtfully. "Why does that sound familiar?" Martin shrugged, still captivated by the image. "I'm not sure, but there's something about these girls." He trailed off, unable to articulate the strange pull he felt toward the photograph. Sarah's expression darkened. "Wait, Blackwood. I think I know that name." She handed the photograph back to Martin and walked to a bookshelf near the register. After a moment of searching, she pulled out a slim volume on New England architecture. "I thought so. My grandmother used to tell stories about a wealthy family up north with that name. Something about a tragedy." "What kind of tragedy?" Martin asked, joining her at the counter. Sarah flipped through the book, then stopped at a page showing a grand Victorian mansion. "Ravenwood Estate," she read. "Built in 1905 by railroad tycoon Maxwell Blackwood." She looked up at Martin. "I can't remember the details, but there were rumors. Strange happenings. The family disappeared suddenly sometime after World War I. Martin carefully placed the photograph on the table and turned to his computer. "Let's see what we can find." The search results were sparse but intriguing. The Blackwood family had been prominent in New England in the early 1900s. Maxwell Blackwood, a railroad magnate, had built a lavish estate called Ravenwood in a small town called Milfield, Vermont. The family had mysteriously withdrawn from public life around 1918, and the estate had been abandoned for decades before being partially restored as a historical landmark in the 1980s. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to an article on the screen. "Maxwell Blackwood had twin daughters. They would have been 8 years old in 1918. Martin felt a chill run down his spine. What happened to them? Sarah scrolled through the article. It doesn't say. Just that the family left Ravenwood suddenly in late 1918. She glanced at another article. There's a mention here that the Spanish flu hit the area hard that year. Thousands died. Martin leaned back in his chair, his eyes drawn again to the photograph. There was something in the twins' expressions, a gravity beyond their years, a hint of something hidden. Their different colored eyes seemed to hold secrets waiting to be uncovered. We should go there, he said suddenly. Go where? Sarah asked, closing the book. To Milfield, to Ravenwood Estate. Martin's voice had an urgency that surprised even him. We should see it for ourselves. Sarah looked at him incredulously. Martin, it's just an old photograph. We get dozens of them every month. This isn't just any photograph, Martin insisted, picking it up again. Look at the quality, the composition, and those eyes. He pointed to the girls' faces. There's a story here, Sarah. I can feel it. Sarah sighed, knowing that tone in her friend's voice. When Martin became fixated on something, there was little chance of dissuading him. They had been friends since college, and she had witnessed his obsessions before. The collection of post-mortem photography that had occupied him for 6 months. The series of circus performer portraits he had tracked down across 3 states. Martin had always been drawn to the stories behind his collections, but this seemed different. There was an intensity in his gaze that concerned her. What about the shop? She asked, a last attempt at practicality. Jake can cover for us. It'll just be for a few days. Martin was already pulling up maps on his computer. Milfield is only about 4 hours from here. We could leave tomorrow. Sarah looked at the photograph again. The twin girls stared back, their different colored eyes seemingly following her. Against her better judgment, she found herself nodding. Fine, she conceded, but just for a few days. And only because I know you won't let this go. Martin grinned, already reaching for his phone to call Jake, their part-time assistant. You're the best, Sarah. I promise it'll be worth it. It better be, she muttered, returning to her ledger. I'm not spending my weekend chasing ghosts for nothing. As Sarah returned to the counter, Martin carefully placed the photograph in a protective sleeve. For a moment, he could have sworn the expressions on the twins' faces had shifted slightly, their mismatched eyes gleaming with something that might have been anticipation. He blinked, and they were just as they had been, solemn Victorian children, forever frozen in time. Or were they? The next morning dawned clear and cold, a perfect late autumn day. Martin arrived at the shop early, a thermos of coffee in one hand and a small overnight bag in the other. He had barely slept, his dreams filled with images of the twin girls, their different colored eyes watching him from the shadows of an unfamiliar house. Sarah arrived 15 minutes later, looking considerably less enthusiastic. I'm still not convinced this isn't a wild goose chase, she said, setting her own bag by the door. Trust me, Martin replied, checking his watch. Jake should be here any minute. As if on cue, the bell above the door jingled, and Jake entered, shaking leaves from his jacket. At 23, he was a recent art history graduate who worked at the shop part-time while pursuing a master's degree. Morning, he said cheerfully. Ready for your ghost hunting expedition? Sarah rolled her eyes. Don't encourage him. Martin handed Jake a list of instructions. We shouldn't be gone more than 3 days. The new shipment from the Peterson estate is coming on Friday. Just sign for it and leave everything in the back room. Jake nodded, glancing at the photograph that Martin had placed on the counter. So this is what's got you all worked up. Creepy kids with weird eyes? They're not creepy, Martin said defensively. They're interesting, if you say so. Jake shrugged. Have fun in Vermont. Bring me back some maple syrup. The drive to Milfield. Vermont was largely silent, each lost in their own thoughts as the landscape transformed from urban sprawl to rolling countryside. The trees were past their peak autumn glory, most of their leaves now carpeting the ground in russet and gold. Martin occasionally glanced at the folder on the dashboard containing the photograph of the Blackwood twins. He couldn't explain his obsession with the image, but something about those girls and their peculiar eyes had lodged in his mind like a splinter. You know, Sarah said, breaking the silence as they crossed the Vermont state line. I've been thinking about those eyes. What about them? Martin asked, glancing away from the road briefly. Heterochromia is rare, but not unheard of. However, for both twins to have it, and in opposite patterns, she frowned. It's statistically improbable. Maybe it's not genetic, Martin suggested. It can be caused by injury or disease too, right? Sarah nodded. Yes, but again, for both of them to develop it in perfectly opposite patterns. She shook her head. It's odd. That's why we're going to Milfield, Martin said, to find answers. It was late afternoon when they arrived in Milfield, a picturesque town that seemed frozen in time. Victorian houses lined the main street, their gingerbread trim and wraparound porches speaking of a bygone era. The town square featured a white gazebo and a statue of what appeared to be a Civil War soldier standing at attention. They checked into the Milfield Inn, a charming bed and breakfast that the innkeeper proudly informed them dated back to 1895. Mrs. Porter, a plump woman in her 60s with silver hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, handed them their keys with a warm smile. "First time in Milfield?" she asked, offering them a plate of homemade cookies. "Yes," Martin replied, taking one. "We're actually here researching the Blackwood family." Mrs. Porter's pleasant smile faltered. "The Blackwoods?" "Yes, specifically their twin daughters." Martin pulled out the photograph and showed it to her. "Eleanor and Elizabeth." Mrs. Porter's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her glasses to examine the image. "The Blackwood twins? Now that's a name I haven't heard in some time." She handed the photograph back to Martin, her expression carefully neutral. "What's your interest in them, if you don't mind my asking?" Martin explained about finding the photograph and his interest in early 20th century portraiture. Mrs. Porter listened attentively, but Sarah noticed how she kept glancing at the photograph, a hint of unease in her eyes. "You might want to speak with Dr. Wells at the Historical Society," Mrs. Porter said finally. "He knows all about the old families of Milfield." "Thank you," Sarah said, taking note of the woman's changed demeanor. "We'll do that." As Mrs. Porter showed them to their room, Martin couldn't resist asking, "Is there something special about the Blackwood twins? You seemed surprised when we mentioned them." Mrs. Porter paused at the top of the stairs. "It's not my place to spread old gossip," she said after a moment, "but the Blackwoods have been a sensitive topic in Milfield for generations." She hesitated, then added, "Some stories are best left in the past, Mr. Reed." Their room was cozy, with floral wallpaper and a four-poster bed that creaked when Martin sat down to review his notes. Sarah unpacked her camera equipment, planning to document their findings. "Well, that was cryptic," she said, referring to Mrs. Porter's warning. "Seems like your twins made quite an impression on this town." Martin nodded, flipping through the pages of information he had printed out before their trip. "The Historical Society opens at 9 tomorrow," he said, checking his phone. "But the estate, what's left of it, is on public land now. We could drive by this evening if you want." Sarah agreed, and within 30 minutes they were back in their car, following the GPS directions to Ravenwood Estate. The road took them through dense woods, the late afternoon sun filtering through the trees in dappled patterns. The road narrowed and began to climb, winding up a gentle slope. "It should be just around this bend," Martin said, peering through the windshield. As they rounded the curve, Sarah gasped. Ravenwood stood on a gentle hill, a grand Victorian mansion with towers and turrets silhouetted against the darkening sky. Though clearly restored in parts, there was an air of melancholy about the place, as if it were mourning its former glory. "It's magnificent," Martin murmured, slowing the car to a crawl. They parked in a small lot near an information board. A sign indicated that the grounds were open until dusk, but the house itself could only be viewed on guided tours, which ran from May through October. "We're in luck," Sarah said, checking the date on the sign. "The last tour of the season is tomorrow at 11. Martin was already walking toward the house, drawn to it like a moth to flame. The gravel path crunched beneath their feet as they approached. The gardens, once surely immaculate, were now simplified but well maintained. They stopped at a respectful distance from the house, taking in its imposing facade. "Can you imagine growing up here?" Sarah murmured, snapping photographs with her professional camera. "Those little girls in their white dresses running through these gardens." Martin didn't answer. He was staring intently at an upper window, where for a moment he thought he'd seen a flicker of movement, a small pale face watching them. But when he blinked, there was nothing there but reflected clouds. "Martin?" Sarah lowered her camera. "What is it?" "Nothing," he said, shaking his head. "Just my imagination." They walked around the perimeter of the house, staying on the marked path. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows across the lawn. The temperature was dropping with the daylight, and Sarah pulled her jacket tighter around her. "We should head back," she said, noticing the deepening shadows. "It'll be dark soon." Reluctantly, Martin turned away from the house. As they walked back to their car, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced back once more at Ravenwood. This time, He was certain. There were two small figures at the window, their faces indistinct in the gathering darkness, but their eyes seemed to glow with different colors. "Martin?" Sarah called, already at the car. "Everything okay?" Martin blinked, and the figures were gone. "Yeah," he said, hurrying to join her. "Just thought I saw something." "This place is getting to you already," Sarah teased, though her voice held a hint of concern. "Let's get some dinner in town. I saw a cozy-looking restaurant near the inn." As they drove away, Martin kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, watching Ravenwood recede into the distance. Just before they turned the corner, he could have sworn he saw two small white shapes standing at the edge of the woods, watching their car disappear. Dinner at the Milfield Tavern was a subdued affair. The restaurant occupied the ground floor of a converted 19th-century home, with wood-paneled walls adorned with local historical photographs. Martin found himself scanning each image, half expecting to see the Blackwood twins staring back at him with their mismatched eyes. "You're obsessing," Sarah noted, sipping her wine. "You've barely touched your food." Martin forced himself to focus on his plate. "Sorry, I just can't stop thinking about those girls and what might have happened to them." "We'll find out more tomorrow," Sarah assured him. "The Historical Society will have records, and the tour should provide some context." As they were waiting for dessert, Martin noticed their waitress, a young woman named Kelly, according to her name tag, giving them curious glances. When she brought their apple pie, he decided to ask, "Excuse me, but we're visiting to research the Blackwood family. Would you happen to know anything about them?" Kelly glanced around as if making sure no one was listening. "The Blackwoods? From Ravenwood?" She lowered her voice. "My great-grandmother used to work in that house as a kitchen maid. She never talked much about it, but I remember her crossing herself whenever anyone mentioned the twins." "The twins?" Martin leaned forward eagerly. "Eleanor and Elizabeth?" Kelly nodded. "There are stories." She hesitated. "Look, it's probably just small-town superstition, but people around here say those girls weren't natural." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. Kelly shrugged uncomfortably. "Just old tales. That they could speak to each other without words. That they knew things they shouldn't have known. That they—" She trailed off, then shook her head. "It's silly, really. Just ghost stories people tell around here." "What happened to them?" Martin pressed. "To the family? The official story is they moved to Europe after the war. But there are other stories." Kelly straightened up as her manager walked by. "Enjoy your dessert. Let me know if you need anything else." She hurried away, leaving Martin and Sarah to exchange meaningful glances. "Well, that was interesting," Sarah murmured. Martin nodded, his mind racing. Something happened in that house. Something people in this town still talk about a century later. That night, Martin dreamed of the twins. In his dream, they stood at the foot of his bed, their white dresses glowing in the moonlight, their different-colored eyes luminous. They didn't speak, but somehow, he understood they wanted him to follow them. They turned and walked through the closed door of his room, vanishing from sight. He woke with a start, his heart pounding. The digital clock on the nightstand read 3:17 a.m. Beside him, Sarah slept peacefully. The room was still, no sign of ghostly visitors. Yet the dream had felt so real that Martin found himself getting out of bed and going to the door, half expecting to find the twins waiting in the hallway. There was nothing there, of course, just the dimly lit corridor of the inn. Martin returned to bed, but sleep eluded him for the rest of the night. He lay awake, listening to the old house creak and settle, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, he was exhausted but relieved. He showered and dressed quietly, trying not to wake Sarah. But when he emerged from the bathroom, she was already up, seated by the window with her laptop. "You look terrible," she observed, glancing up from the screen. "Rough night?" Martin described his dream as he combed his damp hair. Sarah listened with a mix of concern and skepticism. "It's just your mind processing your fascination with the photograph," she said, closing her laptop. "You're projecting significance onto it." "Maybe," Martin conceded, though he wasn't convinced. "But don't you feel it too? There's something about those girls, about this place." Sarah hesitated. "I admit there's something unusual about the photograph, and this town does have a strange atmosphere." She glanced out the window at the misty street below. "But that doesn't mean there's anything supernatural going on." Breakfast in the inn's dining room was a cheerful affair that helped dispel some of the night's unease. Mrs. Porter served fresh scones and local jam, chatting amiably about the weather and local attractions. She made no further mention of the Blackwoods, and Martin didn't press the subject. After breakfast, they headed to the Milfield Historical Society, housed in a stately brick building that had once been the town library. The interior smelled of old books and furniture polish, with display cases showcasing artifacts from the town's past. Old tools, clothing, documents in faded ink. Dr. Wells, the curator, was a tall, thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and an air of distracted intelligence. He greeted them in the main exhibition hall, where he was arranging a display of Civil War memorabilia. "Visitors," he exclaimed as if surprised. "Welcome to the Milfield Historical Society. How can I assist you today?" Martin explained their interest in the Blackwood family, showing Dr. Wells the photograph of the twins. The curator studied it with obvious interest, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to something more guarded. "The Blackwood family?" he repeated when Martin inquired. "Yes, they were quite prominent here in the early 1900s. Maxwell Blackwood made his fortune in railroads and built Ravenwood in 1905. He and his wife, Lillian, were known for their lavish parties. The social elite from Boston and New York would travel up to attend. And they had twin daughters?" Sarah prompted. Dr. Wells nodded. "Eleanor and Elizabeth, born in 1910. Identical twins, though from what I understand, they had heterochromia, different colored eyes." He looked at them curiously. "May I ask why you're interested in the Blackwood twins?" Martin produced the photograph from his folder. "We found this recently. We believe these are the Blackwood twins." Dr. Wells examined the photograph, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he said finally. "That's them. Where did you find this?" "In a collection we purchased from an estate sale," Martin explained. "Can you tell us what happened to them, to the family?" Dr. Wells returned the photograph and sat down at a nearby desk, gesturing for them to take seats opposite him. The official record states that the family left Milfield in late 1918 after a fire damaged part of the estate. Maxwell Blackwood sold his business interests and moved the family to Europe. They never returned. But Martin sensed there was more. Dr. Wells hesitated. "There are local stories. Nothing substantiated, mind you." He removed his glasses and polished them with a handkerchief. Small towns breed gossip, and the sudden departure of a wealthy family naturally led to speculation. "What kind of speculation?" Sarah asked, her notepad ready. "Some said there was a tragedy involving the twins. Others suggested Maxwell Blackwood had suffered financial ruin and fled his creditors." Dr. Wells replaced his glasses, peering at them over the rims. There were even whispers of something unnatural about the girls themselves. Superstitious nonsense, of course, likely stemming from their unusual eyes. "Do you have any other photographs or documents related to the twins?" Martin asked. Dr. Wells shook his head. "Curiously, no. We have several photographs of Maxwell and Lillian, and of Ravenwood in its heyday, but none of the twins apart from official records of their birth. It's as if they were deliberately excluded from the family's visual history." He rose and went to a filing cabinet, from which he retrieved a folder. "Here are some newspaper clippings about the Blackwood family. You're welcome to review them, though I'm afraid they won't tell you much about the twins specifically." They spent another hour reviewing the Historical Society's archives, but found little more about Eleanor and Elizabeth Blackwood. The newspaper clippings chronicled the family's social events, Maxwell's business successes, and eventually, a brief mention of their departure from Milfield for an extended stay in Europe in November 1918. As they were gathering their notes to leave, Dr. Wells called after them. "If you're truly interested in the Blackwood twins, you might want to speak with Agnes Thornfield. She's in her 90s now, but her mother was a maid at Ravenwood. She lives at the Sunny Pines retirement home on the edge of town." He hesitated, then added, "But I should warn you, Mrs. Thornfield's recollections may not be entirely reliable. Age has a way of blurring the lines between memory and imagination." They thanked him and headed straight to Sunny Pines, a pleasant modern facility surrounded by gardens. The October day had turned bright and mild, with just enough chill in the air to remind them that winter was approaching. The retirement home was a stark contrast to the Victorian architecture that dominated the town. All clean lines and large windows designed to let in maximum light. The receptionist was initially reluctant to let them visit Mrs. Thornfield without prior arrangement, but relented when they explained their research interests. "Agnes enjoys visitors," she said, leading them down a corridor decorated with residence artwork. "But please keep your visit brief. She tires easily." Agnes Thornfield sat in a sunlit room, a crocheted blanket over her knees despite the warmth of the day. Her white hair was arranged in a neat bun, and though her face was deeply lined, her eyes were alert and curious as they entered. "Mrs. Thornfield?" Martin approached gently. "My name is Martin Reed, and this is Sarah Cole." We're researching the history of Ravenwood Estate and the Blackwood family. Dr. Wells at the Historical Society suggested we speak with you." The old woman's eyes widened slightly. "Ravenwood," she murmured. "No one's asked me about that place in years." Sarah pulled up chairs for them. "We understand your mother worked there?" Agnes nodded slowly. "Mama was a housemaid for the Blackwoods from 1912 until they left. I was just a child, but sometimes she would take me with her when the family was away." A smile played at her lips. "I would pretend I was a little princess living in that grand house." Martin produced the photograph of the twins. "We're particularly interested in the Blackwood daughters. Did you ever meet them?" Agnes barely glanced at the photograph before turning away, her gnarled hands clutching at her blanket. "Eleanor and Elizabeth," she whispered. "The girls with the strange eyes." Martin and Sarah exchanged glances. "Strange how?" Sarah prompted gently. "They weren't right, those girls," Agnes said, her voice dropping further. "Too quiet, too still. Mama said they would stand for hours in the nursery, just staring at each other without speaking. And sometimes, in the night, the staff would hear them talking in a language no one understood." Martin leaned forward. "What happened to them, Mrs. Thornfield?" Agnes's eyes darted around the room as if checking for eavesdroppers. "There was a sickness in the house that autumn, 1918. The influenza was everywhere then, people dying by the thousands." She paused, her breathing becoming labored. "The twins fell ill first. Dr. Fletcher was called, but he couldn't help them. They died within hours of each other." Sarah's hand found Martin's arm, squeezing it gently. "But Dr. Wells said the family moved to Europe." Agnes laughed, a harsh sound that ended in a cough. "That's what they wanted people to believe. But Mama was there that night. She saw what happened after the girls died." The old woman's voice had taken on a dreamy quality, as if she were reciting a half-remembered fairy tale. "Mrs. Blackwood went mad with grief. She locked herself in the nursery with the bodies and wouldn't let anyone in. Mr. Blackwood finally broke down the door the next morning, and that's when—" She trailed off, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. "That's when what, Mrs. Thornfield?" Martin prompted, his mouth dry. "The girls were sitting up in their beds," Agnes whispered. "Alive, but Mama said they weren't the same. Their eyes had changed. The colors switched between them. And they spoke in unison, in voices that didn't belong to children." She shuddered. "Mama quit that very day. Most of the staff did. The Blackwoods left a week later, in the middle of the night. The house stood empty for years." A nurse appeared in the doorway, checking her watch. "I'm afraid Mrs. Thornfield needs her rest now," she said firmly. As they rose to leave, Agnes clutched at Martin's wrist with surprising strength. "They're still there," she hissed, "in that house, waiting." The girls with the changed eyes. The nurse helped Agnes to her feet. "Don't mind her," she said quietly to Martin and Sarah. "She gets confused sometimes, mixes up stories she's heard with her own memories." Outside in the parking lot, they sat in their car in silence for a moment. "Well, that was—" Sarah began. "Unsettling," Martin finished. He pulled out the photograph of the twins and studied it again. "Do you think there's any truth to her story?" Sarah sighed. "The Spanish flu pandemic was at its height in 1918. Millions died, including many children. It's possible the twins did die and the family left to escape the painful memories." She glanced at her watch. "We should head to Ravenwood. The tour starts in 20 minutes. The drive back to Ravenwood was quiet, each of them lost in thought. Martin couldn't shake Agnes Thornfield's words. "They're still there, in that house, waiting." It sounded like the ramblings of a confused old woman, yet there had been such conviction in her voice, such fear in her eyes. Ravenwood looked different in the morning light, less ominous, more simply a relic of a bygone era. The parking lot had several cars now, and a small group had gathered at the entrance for the tour. Martin and Sarah joined them, blending in with the tourists who were snapping photos of the impressive facade. Their guide, a cheerful woman named Brenda in a Ravenwood Estate polo shirt, greeted the group with practiced enthusiasm. "Welcome to Ravenwood Estate. I'm Brenda, and I'll be your guide today. We'll be exploring the main floor and second level of the house, as well as learning about the Blackwood family who built this magnificent home in 1905. As they entered the grand foyer, Martin was struck by the opulence of the interior. A sweeping staircase dominated the space, its banisters gleaming with polish. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, catching the light from the tall windows. Despite the restoration, there was an unmistakable sense of age about the place, a weight of history that pressed down on them. Brenda led them through the main rooms of the house, recounting its history and architectural features. The house was designed by famous Boston architect Henry Whitcomb, who was known for his Gothic revival style. Maxwell Blackwood spared no expense, importing materials from Europe and hiring the finest craftsmen. Martin half listened, his attention caught by the details, the intricate woodwork, the period furniture, the faded elegance of it all. Sarah dutifully took photographs, occasionally asking Brenda questions about the restoration process. Most of the original furnishings were sold when the estate changed hands in the 1940s, Brenda explained as they entered the grand parlor. What you see here is period appropriate, but not original to the house, with a few exceptions. What about the family? Martin asked. The Blackwoods. Brenda's smile remained fixed. Maxwell Blackwood was a railroad magnate who built Ravenwood as his summer home. He and his wife Lillian were prominent in local society until they relocated to Europe in 1918. And their daughters? Martin pressed. The twins? A flicker of something. Discomfort crossed Brenda's face. The Blackwoods had twin daughters, yes. Unfortunately, we don't have much information about them in our archives. The tour continued upstairs, through the master bedroom and guest quarters. The rooms were meticulously restored, with 4 poster beds and heavy draperies that spoke of Victorian luxury. Finally, they reached a closed door at the end of the hallway. This was the nursery, Brenda said. It's not part of the regular tour as it's currently under renovation, but you can peek through the doorway. She opened the door partially, revealing a large room with faded blue wallpaper. 2 small beds stood against the far wall, their brass frames gleaming dully in the light from the windows. A rocking horse sat in one corner, frozen in mid-gallop. A dollhouse stood on a table, a perfect miniature replica of Ravenwood itself. Martin felt a chill run through him. This was where they had slept, Eleanor and Elizabeth, where, according to Agnes Thornfield, they had died and then impossibly returned to life. Can we go in? He asked. Brenda shook her head. I'm sorry, but the flooring is unstable. Insurance regulations. As the group moved on toward the servants' quarters, Martin lingered, his gaze fixed on the nursery. For a moment, he thought he saw movement near one of the beds, a small figure in white. Then Sarah was beside him, tugging at his arm. Come on, she whispered. You're holding up the tour. The rest of the tour passed in a blur. When it concluded in the grand foyer, Martin approached Brenda while the other visitors filed out. I'm particularly interested in the Blackwood twins, he said, showing her the photograph. We found this recently and are trying to learn more about them. Brenda studied the photograph with a frown. Where did you get this? An estate sale in Vermont, Martin replied. Why? Brenda handed back the photograph. It's just that we don't have any photographs of the twins in our collection. Mrs. Blackwood was said to be very protective of them, didn't like them being photographed. She hesitated. There's something else that might interest you. We keep a log of paranormal claims, ghost sightings and such. Tourists love that sort of thing. The most common report is of 2 little girls seen in the upper windows or in the gardens at dusk, always described as identical, except for their eyes. Sarah, who had joined them, made a skeptical noise. Ghost stories are good for business, I imagine. Brenda smiled thinly. They certainly don't hurt attendance. But I've worked here for 15 years and I've never seen anything unusual myself. She glanced at her watch. I need to prepare for the afternoon tour, but feel free to explore the grounds. Just don't go into any areas marked as closed to the public. As they wandered through the formal gardens behind the house, Martin couldn't shake the image of the twins standing at those upstairs windows, watching with their mismatched eyes. What do you think happened to them? He asked Sarah, who was photographing a weathered stone fountain. She lowered her camera. Honestly, I think Agnes Thornfield's mother probably witnessed the twins' deaths from the Spanish flu. The rest, the resurrection, the switched eyes. That sounds like the kind of folklore that grows around tragic events, especially involving children. Martin nodded slowly. That makes sense. But then, who are the girls people claim to see in the windows? Sarah shrugged. Imagination. Suggestion. Once one person claims to see something, others begin to see it too. She touched his arm. Martin, we've learned what we can here. Maybe it's time to head back. But Martin wasn't ready to leave. Not yet, he said. I want to see the nursery properly. Martin, no. They said it's off limits. Just a quick look, he insisted. The tour's over, and the next one doesn't start for 2 hours. No one will know. Sarah recognized the determined set of his jaw. This is a bad idea, she muttered, but followed him as he made his way back to the house. The side door they'd exited from after the tour was unlocked, as Martin had hoped. They slipped inside, the sudden dimness making them pause to let their eyes adjust. The house was quiet, their footsteps muffled by the runner carpet as they made their way upstairs. The nursery door was still partially open. Martin pushed it wider, wincing at the creak of old hinges. Inside, the room was bathed in pale light filtering through lace curtains. It smelled of dust and old wood, with a faint underlying scent that reminded Martin oddly of winter, cold and clean, and somehow expectant. "The floor seems fine to me," Sarah whispered, testing a board with her foot. "I think Brenda just didn't want us in here." They moved further into the room. The two small beds were made up with faded quilts, as if waiting for their occupants to return. The dollhouse stood in one corner, a perfect miniature replica of Ravenwood itself. A bookshelf held children's books from the early 1900s, their spines cracked with age. Martin approached a dresser where framed photographs stood. Most showed landscapes or formal portraits of adults he assumed were Maxwell and Lillian Blackwood, but one, pushed slightly behind the others, made his breath catch. It was identical to the photograph he carried, the twin girls in white dresses standing before Ravenwood. Except in this version, their eyes were normal. Both girls had dark eyes, with no sign of heterochromia. "Sarah," he called softly, "look at this." She joined him, frowning at the photograph. "That's strange. It's the same pose, the same everything except their eyes," Martin finished. He pulled out their photograph to compare. "In ours, they have different colored eyes. In this one, they don't." Sarah took both photographs, holding them side by side. "This doesn't make sense. Photography in 1918 wasn't sophisticated enough for this kind of manipulation." She looked around the room with new unease. "We should go, Martin. Now." But Martin had moved to the dollhouse, kneeling to peer inside. It was extraordinarily detailed, with tiny furniture in each room, even miniature paintings on the walls. In the nursery of the dollhouse, there were two tiny dolls sitting on the beds. He reached in to touch one. The temperature in the room plummeted suddenly, their breath fogging in the air. The door slammed shut with a bang that made Sarah cry out, and then, from behind them, came the sound of children's laughter. They turned slowly. Two girls stood by the beds, Eleanor and Elizabeth Blackwood, in their white dresses, their different-colored eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. They were holding hands, their expressions solemn despite the laughter they had heard. "You found our photograph," one of them said, her voice oddly musical. "We've been waiting for someone to find it," said the other. Martin could barely speak, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Eleanor? Elizabeth?" The twins tilted their heads in unison, considering him. "I'm Eleanor," said the one on the left. "But I'm also Elizabeth." "And I'm Elizabeth," said the one on the right. "But I'm also Eleanor." Sarah had backed up against the wall, her face pale with shock. "This isn't happening," she whispered. "This isn't real." The twins turned their mismatched gaze to her. "We're as real as you are," they said together. "Just different now." Martin found his voice. "What happened to you? Did you die in the influenza outbreak of 1918? The twins looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them. "We were very sick," Eleanor said. "Mother couldn't bear to lose us," Elizabeth continued. "So she made a bargain." They finished in unison. "A bargain with whom?" Martin asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. The twins smiled, a secretive curve of their lips that sent a shiver down Martin's spine. "Someone old," Eleanor said. "Someone who lived in the woods beyond Ravenwood," added Elizabeth. "Someone who could keep us from dying," they said together. "But there was a price. Our eyes." Eleanor touched her face just below her mismatched gaze. "And our souls," Elizabeth finished. "Half of mine in Eleanor's body, half of mine in Elizabeth's." Eleanor nodded. "We became something new." Sarah had found her phone and was trying to record the twins, but the screen remained black, unresponsive. "What do you want from us?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The twins looked at the photograph in Martin's hand. "We've been trapped here for so long," Eleanor said. "Mother and Father couldn't bear what we'd become," Elizabeth continued. "They tried to undo the bargain. They burned all our photographs thinking it would break the connection," Eleanor explained. "But they missed one." Elizabeth pointed to the picture Martin held. "The one you found. And now you've brought it back to us," they said together, their voices rising with excitement. "Now we can leave." A cold dread settled in Martin's stomach. "Leave? Leave where?" The twins approached them, moving with an unnatural synchronicity. "The photograph is a door," Eleanor said, "but we needed someone to open it from the other side. Someone to bring it back to Ravenwood," Elizabeth added. "Someone curious enough to seek us out," they chorused. Sarah had edged toward the door, her hand on the knob. "Martin, we need to go. Now." But Martin couldn't move, transfixed by the twins and their strange, mismatched eyes. Eyes that seemed to be growing brighter, more luminous. "You'll help us, won't you, Martin?" Eleanor asked, her voice suddenly childlike and pleading. "You found us for a reason," Elizabeth said, reaching for his hand. Sarah yanked at the door, but it remained firmly shut. "Martin!" she shouted. "Snap out of it!" The room had grown darker, the afternoon light fading as if a cloud had passed over the sun. The twins stood before Martin, their eyes now glowing like small, mismatched moons in the dimness. "Just give us the photograph," they said in unison, their hands extended. Something in their tone broke the spell. Martin clutched the photograph tighter and backed away. "No," he said. "I don't think I should do that." The twins' expressions changed, their faces twisting with a fury that no child's face should contain. "Give it to us," they shrieked, their voices no longer sweet, but ragged and inhuman. The room began to shake, books tumbling from shelves, the dollhouse rattling on its stand. The temperature dropped further, frost forming on the windows in delicate fern-like patterns. "Martin, the photograph!" Sarah cried. "Maybe they're right. Maybe it's keeping them here." Martin looked down at the image in his hand, the twins with their different-colored eyes, standing before Ravenwood. Could it really be some kind of supernatural anchor? Or was giving it to them exactly what they wanted? The twins were advancing on him, their movements jerky and unnatural now, like marionettes controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. Behind them, Sarah was frantically trying the door again. In a flash of insight, Martin understood. He pulled out his lighter, a habit from his former smoking days, and held it to the corner of the photograph. "No!" the twins screamed, lunging toward him. The photograph caught fire, the flame eating rapidly through the old paper. The twins howled, a sound of rage and despair that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The shaking intensified, plaster dust raining down from the ceiling. As the last of the photograph burned away, the twins began to change. Their forms grew transparent, their outlines blurring. But instead of disappearing, they seemed to be splitting. 4 figures now stood where 2 had been, each one a faded, ghostly version of one of the twins. "What's happening?" Sarah gasped. The 4 figures regarded each other with confusion, then recognition. 2 of them, the ones with dark eyes like in the photograph on the dresser, began to fade further, their expressions peaceful, almost relieved. The other 2, the ones with heterochromia, writhed and twisted, their faces contorted in fury. They made one last lunge toward Martin, but their forms dissipated like smoke before they reached him, leaving behind a lingering cry that echoed in the still room. The door flew open suddenly, causing Sarah to stumble backward. Light flooded in from the hallway, and with it, a return to normalcy. The temperature rose, the shaking stopped, and the only sound was their ragged breathing. "What just happened?" Sarah whispered, her face ashen. Martin looked at the ashes of the photograph on the floor, then at the identical photograph still sitting on the dresser, the one where the twins had normal eyes. I think we just freed them." "Freed who? The twins?" Martin shook his head slowly. "Not exactly. I think," he tried to put his thoughts in order, "I think when Mrs. Blackwood made her bargain, something else took up residence in her daughters' bodies. Something that had been waiting for a way back into our world. The original photograph, the one with the different colored eyes, was some kind of link or portal, and by destroying it you severed the connection." Sarah finished, beginning to understand. The real Eleanor and Elizabeth were finally able to move on, and the others were sent back where they came from. Martin nodded, his gaze drawn to the peaceful expression on the twins in the remaining photograph. "We should go," he said quietly. "We've done what we needed to do here." As they made their way downstairs, they nearly collided with Brenda, who was coming up. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "This area is off limits between tours." "We're sorry," Sarah apologized quickly. "We got turned around looking for the restroom." Brenda looked suspicious, but led them back to the main area. As they were leaving, Martin turned to her. "You might find that the sightings of the twin girls stop after today," he said. Brenda raised an eyebrow. "And why is that?" Martin smiled slightly. "Just a feeling. Sometimes all a restless spirit needs is for someone to listen to their story." They drove back to Milfield in thoughtful silence. At the inn, as they packed their belongings, Sarah finally spoke. "Do you think anyone will believe us if we tell them what happened?" Martin considered this. "Probably not. But that doesn't change what we experienced." He closed his suitcase. "Besides, I don't think this is a story we're meant to spread. Some mysteries should remain just that. Mysteries." Sarah nodded slowly. "What about the other photograph? The one in the nursery with the normal eyes?" "I left it there," Martin said. "It belongs with them, as a reminder of who they really were before, whatever happened to them." As they drove away from Milfield, Martin caught a glimpse of Ravenwood in the rearview mirror, its towers silhouetted against the setting sun. For a moment, he thought he saw two small figures standing at the edge of the woods, hand in hand, watching them leave. But when he blinked, they were gone. The journey back seemed quicker somehow, as if the distance between Milfield and home had contracted now that their mission was complete. They spoke little, each processing what had happened in their own way. Sarah remained skeptical, suggesting that perhaps they had experienced a shared hallucination brought on by suggestion and the power of the story they had been researching. Martin didn't argue, but he knew what he had seen, what he had felt in that cold nursery with its twin beds and watchful dolls. The antique shop on Maple Street welcomed them back with its familiar musty scent and ticking clocks. Jake had managed things well in their absence, and there were even a few sales to record in the ledger. "Find what you were looking for?" Jake asked as they settled back into their routine. Martin and Sarah exchanged glances. "In a way," Martin replied. "Let's just say we solved a mystery." "Cool," Jake said, clearly expecting more details but too polite to press when none were forthcoming. "Oh, a woman called yesterday asking about early 20th century photography. Said she'd stop by again today." Martin nodded, already distracted by the need to catch up on paperwork. The rest of the day passed in ordinary tasks, cataloging new acquisitions, arranging displays, assisting the occasional customer. By closing time, Martin was almost able to convince himself that their experience at Ravenwood had been some kind of shared delusion, a story they had collectively brought to life through the power of suggestion and imagination. Almost, but not quite. That night, after Sarah had gone home and Martin was alone in the shop, he found himself drawn to the wooden box where he had first discovered the photograph of the Blackwood twins. He sifted through the remaining photographs, wondering if there were other stories waiting to be uncovered, other mysteries calling out to be solved. At the very bottom of the box, tucked into a corner, he found a small folded piece of paper. Opening it carefully, he discovered a note written in faded ink, in a child's careful handwriting. "Thank you for finding us. Thank you for setting us free. E&E." Martin stared at the note, a chill running down his spine. It couldn't have been there before. He had emptied the box entirely when first going through it. Yet here it was, a message from beyond time and understanding. He carefully refolded the note and placed it back in the box. Some things, he decided, were better left as mysteries, but he would keep collecting, keep searching through forgotten images and abandoned mementos, because sometimes the past needs a witness to set its stories free, and somewhere, in a peaceful place beyond human comprehension, two little girls with matching dark eyes were finally at rest, their souls complete, their long vigil ended. The other presence that had shared their bodies for over a century was gone, banished back to whatever dark corner of existence it had come from. Ravenwood would stand for many years to come, but its most persistent haunting had finally come to an end. The days turned into weeks, and the memory of Ravenwood began to fade, like an old photograph left too long in the sun. Martin continued his work at the antique shop, cataloging new acquisitions, researching provenance, helping customers find the perfect piece of history to take home. But something had changed in him since that day in the nursery. He found himself looking more closely at the photographs that passed through his hands, searching for signs of something beyond the ordinary. A shadow where no shadow should be, a figure half hidden in the background, eyes that seemed to follow him as he moved. Sarah noticed the change in him. "You're still thinking about those twins, aren't you?" she asked one rainy afternoon as they closed up shop. Martin didn't deny it. "Wouldn't you, if you'd seen what we saw?" Sarah sighed. "I'm still not convinced we saw anything, Martin. Mass hysteria is a documented phenomenon. We went to that house expecting to find something strange, and our minds obliged. And the note in the box, the one that wasn't there before? You might have overlooked it the first time," Sarah suggested. "Or Jake might have found it and put it back." Martin knew better than to argue. Sarah had always been the practical one, the rationalist. It was one of the things he valued about their partnership, her ability to ground his sometimes fanciful flights of imagination. But in this case, he knew what he had experienced was real. The cold of that room, the fury in those unearthly eyes, the relief on the faces of the true Eleanor and Elizabeth as they finally found peace, these weren't figments of an overactive imagination. Martin never again found a photograph that affected him as deeply as the one of the Blackwood twins. But occasionally, when sorting through new acquisitions or organizing displays, he would feel a presence, gentle and grateful, watching over him. And sometimes, in his dreams, he would see two little girls in white dresses, their dark eyes peaceful, waving goodbye from the edge of a sunlit garden. The box of photographs from Vermont eventually yielded many interesting items for Martin's collection, but none with the extraordinary history of the twins' photograph. He often wondered about the bargain their mother had made, and with whom. What entity lived in the woods beyond Ravenwood that had the power to cheat death but at such a terrible price? Some questions, he decided, were better left unanswered. Sarah gradually came to terms with their experience at Ravenwood, though she remained more skeptical than Martin about its supernatural nature. Maybe it was mass hallucination, she suggested once, or some kind of toxic mold in that old nursery causing us to see things. But even she couldn't explain the note that had appeared in the box, or the fact that when they called the Milfield Historical Society 6 months later to follow up on their research, Dr. Wells mentioned that the reported sightings of ghostly twins at Ravenwood had indeed stopped completely after their visit. It's been good for tourism, actually, he told them. Now we're known as the haunted house where the ghosts finally found peace. People are fascinated by the idea of a resolution to a ghostly tale. Life went on. The antique shop prospered. Martin continued his collection of early 20th century photography, developing a particular interest in images of children from that era, though he never again came across any with heterochromia. One autumn day, nearly a year after their visit to Ravenwood, a package arrived at the shop. It bore no return address, only a postmark from Milfield, Vermont. Inside was a small, leather-bound book, a diary. A note from Brenda at Ravenwood Estate explained that during recent renovations of the servants' quarters, workers had discovered the diary hidden in a wall cavity. The name inside identified it as belonging to Clara Thornfield, Agnes's mother, the maid who had worked for the Blackwoods. "I remembered your interest in the Blackwood family," Brenda wrote. "This seemed like something that should be in your collection." That night, after closing the shop, Martin sat down with the diary and began to read. Clara Thornfield's neat, precise handwriting recounted her days at Ravenwood, painting a picture of life in a wealthy household in the early 1900s. Her entries were mostly mundane. Descriptions of her duties, gossip about other staff members, occasional complaints about the housekeeper's strict standards. But as Martin reached the entries from October 1918, the tone changed. Clara wrote of the influenza reaching Milfield, of the fear that gripped the town as people began to fall ill and die. Then came the entry that made Martin's blood run cold. October 15th, 1918. "The twins have taken ill, both at once, as is their way. Dr. Fletcher was called, but says there is little to be done but keep them comfortable and pray. Mrs. Blackwood is beside herself. Mr. Blackwood has shut himself in his study with his whiskey. The house feels different tonight, colder somehow, despite the fires in every grate. And there is something else. I heard Mrs. Blackwood talking to herself in the garden at dusk, only I don't think she was alone. I couldn't see who she was speaking to, but I heard her say, 'Anything. I would give anything.' It made my heart turn over to hear the desperation in her voice. A mother's love is a powerful thing, but some prices are too high to pay, even for love." October 16th, 1918. "They died this morning within minutes of each other. Elizabeth first, then Eleanor, as if she couldn't bear to be left behind. Mrs. Blackwood won't leave the nursery, won't allow the bodies to be moved. Mr. Blackwood tried to comfort her, but she screamed at him to get out. The staff are whispering that she's lost her mind with grief, but I'm afraid it's something worse." October 17th, 1918. "I hardly know how to write what I witnessed today. Mr. Blackwood broke down the nursery door this morning after Mrs. Blackwood failed to respond to his knocking. We found her sitting between the twins' beds, singing a lullaby. And the twins, they were sitting up, watching her with those eyes, those terrible, changed eyes. They were not dead, yet neither were they as they had been. They spoke in unison. in a language I've never heard before. And when they saw their father, they smiled in a way that no child should smile. Mrs. Blackwood acted as if everything was normal, as if it was perfectly natural for her daughters to have returned from death, with different colored eyes and voices that made the air itself seem to shiver. I gave my notice on the spot. Most of the staff did the same. As I was leaving, I passed the garden where I had seen Mrs. Blackwood the night before. The ground there was disturbed, as if something had been buried or unearthed, and at the edge of the woods, I saw markings carved into a tree, symbols that hurt my eyes to look upon. Whatever bargain she made, it was not with God. This was the last entry. Martin sat back, the diary heavy in his hands. Clara Thornfield's account confirmed Agnes's story and filled in crucial details. Lillian Blackwood, driven by maternal desperation, had made some kind of dark pact to save her daughters. But what had returned to those little bodies wasn't entirely Eleanor and Elizabeth. Parts of them had been replaced by something else, something that had waited patiently for a century for a chance to escape its partial imprisonment. Martin carefully closed the diary and placed it in his safe, alongside the note from the twins. Some stories deserve to be preserved, even if they were never meant to be widely shared. He thought of the twins as they had appeared at the end, the peaceful ones with matching dark eyes who had finally found rest, and the twisted, furious ones with mismatched eyes who had been sent back to whatever darkness had spawned them. It was enough, he decided, to know that in some small way, he and Sarah had helped bring a long, tragic story to its conclusion. The real Eleanor and Elizabeth Blackwood were at peace, and whatever had partially possessed them was gone. The photograph that had called to him across time had served its purpose, and now it was ashes, its power broken. That night, Martin dreamed of Ravenwood again, but this time, the dream was different. He stood in the gardens behind the house, but they were vibrant and well-tended, as they must have been in 1918. Children's laughter echoed from nearby, and he turned to see two little girls in white dresses playing with a ball on the lawn. Their eyes were dark and matching, their faces bright with innocent joy. This, he realized, was Ravenwood before tragedy struck, before the influenza, before the desperate bargain, before everything changed. One of the girls, he couldn't tell if it was Eleanor or Elizabeth, looked up and saw him. She smiled and waved as if to a familiar friend. The other twin followed her gaze, her expression curious but unafraid. Then a woman's voice called from the house, "Girls, time for tea," and they ran off, their white dresses billowing behind them like the wings of small birds. Martin woke with tears on his face, though he couldn't have said why. The dream had been peaceful, even happy. Perhaps it was the poignancy of seeing the twins as they should have been, ordinary children with their lives ahead of them, untouched by the darkness that would later claim them. The following day, Martin called Sarah early. "I need to tell you something," he said without preamble. "If this is about those twins again," she began. "Just hear me out," he interrupted. "I received Clara Thornfield's diary yesterday. It confirms everything Agnes told us." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "You're sure it's authentic?" Sarah finally asked. "It came from Brenda at Ravenwood. They found it hidden in a wall during renovations." Another pause. "Bring it to the shop. I want to see it." When Sarah arrived an hour later, Martin was waiting with the diary. She examined it carefully, her skeptical expression gradually giving way to troubled acceptance as she read Clara's final entries. "This doesn't prove anything supernatural," she said at last, closing the diary. "Just that the twins died and then appeared to be alive again. There could be a medical explanation. For eyes that change color, for speaking in unknown languages." Martin shook his head. "You were there, Sarah. You saw what happened in that nursery." Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I saw something, yes, but I still don't know what it was." "Does it matter?" Martin asked gently. "Whatever it was, it's over now. The real Eleanor and Elizabeth are at peace." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I suppose that's what counts in the end." They agreed not to speak of Ravenwood again. The diary joined the note in Martin's safe, and life continued its predictable rhythm. But occasionally, when the shop was quiet and the afternoon sun slanted through the dusty windows, Martin would think of two little girls in white dresses, standing before a grand house, their dark eyes peaceful at last. 3 years passed. The antique shop thrived, expanding into the vacant storefront next door. Sarah married a local history professor who shared her love of Victorian architecture. Martin remained single, married to his work and his collections. The story of Ravenwood and the Blackwood twins receded into memory, becoming just another strange tale in a life filled with old objects and their histories. Then, on a crisp October morning, much like the one when he had first found the photograph, Martin received a letter. The envelope was cream-colored and heavyweight, the address written in an elegant, old-fashioned hand. Inside was a single sheet of matching stationery and a newspaper clipping. The clipping was from the Milfield Gazette, dated the previous week. It reported that Ravenwood estate would be closing to the public at the end of the month. The Historical Society had decided to sell the property due to mounting maintenance costs. The new owner, an unnamed private collector, planned to restore the house to its original condition for personal use. The letter was brief. "Dear Mr. Reed, I thought you should know that Ravenwood will soon have a new caretaker. The house called to me, as it once called to you. Rest assured, I will honor its history and the peace you helped bring to its former occupants. The nursery, in particular, will be restored with the greatest care. If you should ever wish to visit, you would be most welcome. The twins, I believe, would be pleased to see you again, though only in memory and in the photograph that remains on their dresser. With gratitude for your role in the house's story, L.B." There was no return address, no signature beyond those initials. Martin read the letter 3 times, trying to decipher its meaning. L.B. Who could that be? And how did they know about his experience at Ravenwood, about the photograph on the dresser? He showed the letter to Sarah when she came in later that morning. She read it with a frown, her skepticism immediately evident. "This is strange," she admitted. "L.B. Lillian Blackwood? That's impossible," Martin said. "She'd be over 130 years old. A descendant, then? Someone who heard the story from Dr. Wells or Brenda?" Martin shook his head. "I don't know. But whoever it is knows what happened in that nursery." Sarah handed the letter back to him. "Are you going to go? To visit?" Martin considered this. Part of him was intensely curious about the letter's author and their connection to Ravenwood. But another part, the part that still occasionally dreamed of cold rooms and glowing, mismatched eyes, hesitated. "No," he said finally. "I think that chapter is closed. The twins are at peace. Ravenwood will have a new life with this L.B. person. Better to leave it at that." Sarah seemed relieved. "I think that's wise." That night, as Martin was locking up the shop, he thought he caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection of the front window. 2 small figures in white, standing behind him. But when he turned, there was nothing there but shadows and the familiar clutter of his antique shop. As he locked the door and turned toward home, Martin smiled to himself. Perhaps the twins had come to say goodbye, one last time. Or perhaps it was just his imagination, still captivated by their story after all these years. Either way, he was grateful to have been part of their tale, to have helped bring peace to Ravenwood and its most persistent ghosts. Eleanor and Elizabeth Blackwood had found their rest at last, their souls made whole again after a century of fractured existence. As for the other entities, the ones with the mismatched eyes and inhuman voices, they had been sent back to whatever darkness had spawned them. Martin sometimes wondered if they were still out there, seeking another door, another way into the world. But that was a worry for another day, another story. For now, it was enough to know that sometimes the past can be healed, sometimes old wrongs can be righted, and sometimes all it takes is one curious soul willing to listen to the whispers of history and help set its captives free. As Martin walked home through the quiet streets, he felt a sense of completion, of a circle closed. The mystery of the Blackwood twins and their different colored eyes had been solved, but the broader mystery of what waited beyond the veil of death remained. Martin was content to leave that question unanswered, at least until his own time came to find out. Until then, he would continue his work as a collector, a preserver of memories, a witness to histories both ordinary and extraordinary. For now, it was enough to know that somewhere, 2 little girls who had been trapped between worlds for over a century were finally at rest, their souls complete, their story told, and in a safe in his shop, a small note in a child's handwriting remained as the only tangible evidence of their gratitude. "Thank you for finding us. Thank you for setting us free." E&D, some photographs capture more than just a moment in time. Some capture souls, stories, mysteries that transcend understanding. For Martin Reed, collector of forgotten images, the photograph of the Blackwood twins with their different colored eyes had been such an image, a doorway between worlds, a cry for help across the decades, a mystery that had called to him and him alone to solve. Now, as he turned the key in his apartment door and stepped into the familiar comfort of his home, he felt a sense of completion, of a circle closed. The Blackwood twins had found their peace, and in helping them, Martin had discovered something about himself, a sensitivity to the echoes of the past, the ability to hear the whispers of those long gone. He would be more careful in the future, more attuned to the stories hidden in his collections, because sometimes the past doesn't stay past. Sometimes it reaches forward, seeking understanding, seeking resolution, seeking release. And sometimes all it takes is one person willing to listen, to believe, to act, to set the trapped souls free. As Martin drifted off to sleep that night, he dreamed not of ghostly twins with mismatched eyes, but of a sunny garden where two little girls with dark matching eyes played without care, their laughter bright and normal, their souls intact, their long vigil finally ended. In the morning, he would return to his shop, to his collections, to the everyday rhythm of his life, but he would do so with new awareness, new purpose. The mystery of the Blackwood twins had been solved, but there were countless other mysteries waiting in forgotten photographs and abandoned mementos, and Martin Reed, collector and witness to the past, would be ready for them. Years later, long after the events at Ravenwood had faded into the background of his memory, Martin found himself attending an auction of estate items from a recently deceased collector in Boston. The collection was impressive: rare books, antique furniture, and, most intriguing to Martin, an extensive array of early photography. As he browsed the items before the auction began, something caught his eye: a leather-bound album with the embossed initials MB. His heart quickened as he carefully opened the cover. Inside were photographs of Ravenwood estate in its prime, the gardens in full bloom, the interiors lavishly furnished, servants lined up on the front steps. And there, on the third page, was a family portrait: a stern-looking man with a handlebar mustache, a beautiful woman with sad eyes, and between them, two little girls in white dresses, Maxwell and Lillian Blackwood, with Eleanor and Elizabeth. Martin studied the photograph closely. The twins appeared to be about 5 or 6 in this image, younger than in the photograph he had found. Their eyes were normal, matching dark eyes that showed no hint of the heterochromia that would later mark them as something other than fully human. He turned the page and froze. The next photograph showed Lillian Blackwood standing at the edge of the woods behind Ravenwood. She was alone, her face turned partially away from the camera, but her expression visible enough to show a desperate determination. Behind her, barely discernible among the trees, was a figure, tall and thin and somehow wrong in its proportions. The image was blurry, as if the figure had moved during the exposure, but Martin could make out what appeared to be elongated fingers reaching toward Lillian. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Was this the entity she had made her bargain with? The thing from the woods that had saved her daughters, but at such a terrible cost? He closed the album quickly, suddenly reluctant to see what other secrets it might contain. When the auction began, he bid aggressively for the album, ignoring Sarah's questioning glances from the seat beside him. The bidding went higher than he had anticipated, but in the end, the album was his. "What was that about?" Sarah asked as they left the auction house, the album wrapped carefully in brown paper under Martin's arm. "You paid 3 times what we budgeted for that lot." "Insurance," Martin said cryptically. "Some things shouldn't be in circulation." That night, alone in his apartment, Martin examined each page of the album carefully. Most of the photographs were ordinary enough: family portraits, images of Ravenwood, social gatherings of the wealthy elite of early 20th century New England. But interspersed among them were troubling images: the strange figure at the edge of the woods, appearing in different locations around the property, close-ups of carvings on trees that made Martin's eyes hurt to look at them, and, most disturbing of all, a series of photographs documenting the twins' transformation. The final image in the album showed the twins after their resurrection, standing in the nursery, holding hands, their different colored eyes staring directly into the camera. On the back, written in what Martin recognized as Maxwell Blackwood's handwriting from other notations in the album, were the words, "Not my daughters. God forgive us." Martin closed the album, his decision made. The next day, he drove to a remote area outside the city, built a small fire, and burned the album page by page. As the last photograph, the one of the twins with their mismatched eyes, curled and blackened in the flames, he thought he heard very faintly a sound like children's laughter. Not the twisted, unnatural laughter he had heard in the nursery at Ravenwood, but the innocent, joyful sound of children at play. As the final ashes floated away on the breeze, Martin whispered, "Rest well, Eleanor and Elizabeth. Your story is over now." And somewhere beyond the veil of human understanding, two little girls with matching dark eyes smiled and turned away, hand in hand, finally free to move on to whatever awaited them in the great beyond. Martin returned to his life, to his shop, to his collections. He never spoke of the album or what it contained, not even to Sarah. Some secrets, he believed, were meant to remain buried, some stories meant to end. But he kept the original note from the twins in his safe, a reminder that sometimes the collector becomes part of the collection's story. Sometimes the past reaches out to the present, seeking resolution, and sometimes a simple act of understanding can set restless spirits free. In the years that followed, Martin continued to seek out unusual photographs, drawn to the stories they contained, the glimpses they offered into lives long ended. But he never again encountered anything like the photograph of the Blackwood twins with their different colored eyes. And for that, he was profoundly grateful. The end.